Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, episode 17, Rediscovering Desire. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. Even though this episode is titled Rediscovering Desire, I kind of went back and forth if it should be Discovering Desire or Rediscovering Desire. I hope that for those of you who feel like I actually have never found my desire, you'll have some good tips as well about how to move forward discovering your desire, or for those of us who maybe went into marriage or a relationship and we had desire and suddenly we don't know where it went. This episode is also for you. I'm so excited to have Carlie Palmer-Webb back on with us today to talk about desire, a very misunderstood concept around sexuality. And we're going to go in depth about spontaneous versus responsive desire. And they're both good, they're both valid, and they're both just as desirable. We just haven't been taught that. Carlie Palmer-Webb is a sex educator and a gender and sexuality researcher. She loves helping Christian women understand and embrace their sexuality, and it's one of her greatest passions. Carlie was born and raised in Weiser, Idaho, and now lives in Vermont with her husband, Dallin, and their cat, Maple. She is abnormally tall and is a lover of mint-flavored chocolate, rock climbing, and cheese. I just want to thank you again for joining me on this journey of learning to embrace and fully understand our sexuality as women. It can be scary sometimes, and I just really am grateful that you're here and you're listening and you're participating. Thank you so much. And I would love to ask a favor of you. If this episode or other episodes that you have listened to have been meaningful or helpful or started a good conversation with your family, your partner or spouse, I would really appreciate if you could share those with your friends or on social media. It helps others find the show and hopefully make a difference in their lives as well. Like always, let's get on the show and talk some love. It's so fun to have Carlie back on. Thanks for joining me again.
So happy to be here.
We are going to dive into desire today. And as I was thinking about this topic, I just kept thinking about so many women in my life and my friends who have talked about their struggles with desire, where they had desire before they got married, but then they got married and they didn't feel any desire, or they've never really felt desire. And I think that a lot of these things actually come from our misunderstanding of desire. And so I'm so excited to kind of dig in. I hope that this will answer a lot of your questions that people have about desire. So just to start us off, can you give us a little definition? What is desire?
Sure. I don't think this definition is anything official, but in general, desire requires there to be something that you want that you don't currently have, right? We're unsatisfied with our current state and we're wanting something else. So as far as sexual desire goes, it's a feeling of wanting a sexual experience that you're not currently having.
So then what causes desire?
So many different things. That's I know that we'll get into it in more detail moving forward on this podcast episode, but there are so many different things that contribute to someone's sexual desire. And learning what things lead to desire for you is an important part of understanding and embracing your sexuality. But I'll just throw in right here, one of the things we need to understand as we try to learn what leads to desire is that the things that draw us to sexual desire will change. So one day, something that your spouse does can make you really excited about having sex. And then they do the same thing a different day. And it's like, nope, I'm just with you today. A lot of different things can lead to desire.
And I love thinking about that though, because I think that was one of my biggest misunderstandings about desire is that everyone has something that leads to desire. Like arousal happens before desire. Is that right?
It does for a lot of people. Yeah. That some people require arousal first to experience desire. Some people can experience desire without arousal, which we'll talk about too, the differences between spontaneous and responsive desire.
And that it's not always like a physical arousal, but something helps lead to the desire. So something has to be there, which I hadn't understood with men before, because it was like, oh, they just sometimes want it and nothing, but there's something that leads to it, which was important for me to understand. So as we're going into that, talking about the understanding that, like, what are some of the misconceptions that we have around desire?
I think one of the first ones is that desire and arousal are the same thing. So we expect that they'll exist simultaneously if they're not the exact same thing. But for the most part, we talk about sexual desire and sexual arousal in kind of the same ways. But desire and arousal are actually two completely different things. And it's important for us to understand the difference in order to figure out our desire maps, right? So desire is happening in our minds. It's the wanting of something in our minds. Arousal is our body's response to sexual cues or sexual context. So if we understand that desire is our thoughts and arousal is our physical experience, so blood rushing to our genitals, an erection, lubrication of the vagina, things like that, that's arousal. And when we understand that they're separate, we can figure out how to make both happen. So for a lot of women, especially, who are more likely to experience desire after arousal, what they're expecting to happen is that they'll start to want sex randomly throughout the day. That's what they're hoping will happen, that I'll just be thinking about sex and I'll be like, ooh, sex sounds fun. And then they can tell their partner, hey, I'm interested in sex. That's kind of what women think desire feels like and what it will look like. And if they're not experiencing that, they feel like something's wrong with them. But when we understand that desire and arousal are two separate things, and sometimes arousal needs to come before desire, then we can say, okay, I want to have sex. And if I want to have sex, then the first step for me might be a nice hot makeout session with my husband. If I want to have sex, it might require some physical affection and physical arousal before the desire to have sex comes. And that's not a problem. It's just a difference, right? So we have to recognize the differences between desire and arousal if we're really going to be in control of our sex life in the way that we want to be.
Which I think we've been lied to our whole lives.
Oh, yeah.
Because the media, like everything just shows spontaneous desire, which we'll talk a little more about this, but it shows spontaneous desire. So when, especially as women, I think I was just reading the stats. I think it said in Dr. Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are, that 75% of men experience spontaneous desire and 15% of women have spontaneous desire. But that is what the media shows as the norm. And so when we aren't thinking like, oh, I'm ready to go, we feel like we're not having desire and something's wrong with us. But I think that's so beautiful to remember. Oh, like I can create a context, or I can create something that can help me get in the mood. And it's more about willingness. Like I'm willing to get in the mood and figuring out what that looks like.
Definitely. And I think a lot of women, when they don't experience spontaneous desire, they just assume that they're not really sexual people anymore. Like, I just must not be that interested in sex, or I must not be a high desire person. But you might actually be very interested in sex and really enjoy it when you have it. You just need the right context and the right motivation to experience a really strong desire to have sex. And that's totally normal.
And I know for me, it's little things sometimes that can make me not feel desire. Like if my house is a complete wreck at the end of the day, like I'm not in the mood. But I think sometimes as women, it's like, well, if I was just in the mood, it'd be fine no matter what. But there are things, whether it's childcare
Yeah.
or house cleaning or making out or whatever, that can help us. But it's just so hard to realize that's normal.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Whatever, wherever you're at
It
is
is.
totally normal.
It is. And it's not, it doesn't mean that it's permanent, right? If you don't feel like you're experiencing any desire right now, that doesn't mean that you can't. Rarely is there something in our sex lives that has to be permanent. It's all malleable. We just have to have the right tools, the right understanding, and we can make changes that make our sex lives a lot better.
And so if we can break it down or maybe give a little more examples to make it more clear, like what is spontaneous desire? What does it look like? And what does responsive desire look like? How can we kind of understand those?
Yeah, definitely. So spontaneous and responsive desire are the two primary forms of sexual desire. And they're a little self-explanatory, but just to dive in a little bit, spontaneous desire is when you experience the desire for sex or physical intimacy randomly throughout the day, not necessarily as a response to a sexual cue. Our bodies are always responding to something, right? Like you mentioned, Ariel. But you'll think about sex randomly throughout the day and just think, hey, sex sounds fun, or, ooh, I really want to have sex tonight. That's spontaneous desire. Oftentimes, the desire for sex comes before arousal for spontaneous desire. So you want to have sex, you're looking forward to sex, and then arousal follows with spontaneous desire. Like you mentioned earlier, on average, a lot more men experience spontaneous desire, though there are a lot of women who experience spontaneous desire. It's likely that all women will experience spontaneous desire at some point in their life.
I feel like it happens a lot, especially for those of us who were maybe trying to wait to have sex until we were married. I think a lot of us probably felt it in the dating phase. Yeah. And then we got married and we're like, wait a minute, like, what happened here? But I remember reading, it's just like, I think it said there was like 35% of women have responsive and the rest is a mix. And so I think we will probably experience some of what we may have felt before we got married if we were trying to wait, but it's just different.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of women experience spontaneous desire and then they have their first child and will go a long time only experiencing responsive desire. And that can feel really jarring because they're like, whoa, I used to really be excited about sex and now I don't even think about sex. Is something wrong with me? No, your desire has just shifted along with every other part of your life that shifts when you have a child. So it makes sense that what's going on in our brains, which is where desire is happening, also shifts when our life takes a big turn, like having a child. So that's spontaneous desire. Responsive desire is the opposite, essentially. You rarely think about sex during the day. Some say that they never think about sex randomly. It doesn't even come to their mind. You need a sexual cue or a sexual context in order to feel like you can start getting to desire. So you need to be physically affectionate with your partner, or you need to be dancing and candles. And I know it sounds kind of cheesy, but you need to have a sexual context to respond to. Sometimes it will be a kissing scene in a movie, or something like that can also bring the thoughts of like, oh, actually, this is kind of making me get a little excited to be with my partner. That's responsive desire. And for some, they may never experience the desire for sex until their body is aroused. So it might require some willingness to engage in kissing, touching each other. Dancing is a personal favorite. I can't dance. I'm not a good dancer, but I like dancing with my spouse. So you might have to do those things first, and then the desire for sex follows. It does feel a little scary sometimes for people who experience only responsive desire to open themselves up to some physical affection, because they're like, but what if the desire for sex never comes? And then I have to say that I don't want to have sex to my spouse after we've already been making out for 15 minutes, that can feel a little scary, but you just have to have the conversations with your spouse or partner before and say, like, I'm trying to explore responsive desire, but I don't want to feel pressured into having sex if we're exploring this and I'm still not wanting it. So what should we do if we explore my physical arousal and I still don't find desire? How should we respond?
I like that idea of talking about it beforehand, because that will help eliminate a lot of hurt that could happen.
Yeah, definitely.
It's so important because you don't want to hurt your partner, but you also want them to be on board to help you learn. And I know for me, realizing that responsive desire is a thing is sometimes like, oh, dang it. Like, this sounds like more work.
Harder.
I don't need more work, Carlie. Come on. Why are you telling me this? But so what are some tips you would give us, or some ways that we could start to discover what would help us move into this responsive desire when maybe we're realizing like, that's what's been happening?
No, totally. I can understand the discouragement of that because I don't have children yet. I haven't had any big life shifts that led to a shift from spontaneous to responsive desire, but I am quite a high desire person and experienced a lot of spontaneous desire initially when I was married. And then I got on a medication that totally killed my spontaneous desire. And it was quite discouraging at first, but then it was a little, I know this might sound annoying, but it was a little bit fun to try and figure out how to get me there. It was fun to explore different things and to talk to my husband about, what can we try to get me aroused, So a few things that I would say if you're experiencing responsive desire and want to try and explore that. The first thing is what you mentioned, Ariel, which is willingness. That's kind of the hardest part, is opening yourself up to a physically intimate encounter when you're not sure if you're going to want sex after. That can feel really vulnerable for you and for your partner because you don't want to hurt them. And so it can feel scary. And willingness, when you're not feeling up to sex at this point, willingness to try to get there can feel really exhausting too. But that's the first thing I would say. And we need to understand that if we want to have a good sex life, we have to prioritize it. And willingness to try is one of the ways that we prioritize it.
I love how you talked earlier, though, about making sure to talk with your partner about that, especially as I've heard lots of women just talk about how like, oh, he like touched me, he wants sex. And I think sometimes when we're in the responsive desire category, we automatically associate physical touch with an expression of our spouse saying, I want sex. And I think that can really limit the ability for responsive desire, because a lot of those touches might not be, I want sex. It might just be, I love you. But if we can't have that open conversation about responsive desire and what you feel when they try to hug you or kiss you, that like, I feel like you always want sex and I'm not sure I can go there. I think it opens up a lot more ability to have intimate moments throughout the day that can help your responsive desire without feeling pressure that like, oh, every time he does that, he wants sex. Because guaranteed, a lot of times your partner probably just wants to say hi.
Definitely. And really nothing will stomp out sexual desire more than feeling like you have to do something you don't want to do. So feeling like you're being pushed into sex or you feel obligated to have sex is one of the quickest ways to kill desire. And so initially, when you're starting to explore responsive desire, it might require that you say to your partner, I really want to just have a makeout session for 20 minutes, but I don't want to have sex tonight. Is that okay? And if you start with that, then you can just learn to experience physical affection again and enjoy it without the pressure of sex coming after. And you can do that several times, right? You can say like, we're not going to have any sex this week. Is that okay? But I still want to be really physically affectionate because I'm trying to learn to understand my sexual desire. And it might be a difficult conversation to have, but if your spouse is really invested in your sexual pleasure, which I realize is not a gift that everyone experiences in their marriage or their relationship, but if they are invested in your sexual pleasure and your experience and you feeling loved and cherished, then they'll be willing to explore these things with you.
And I think it's so good for me as I've looked at my desires. Well, sometimes it takes a little time, but I can pinpoint things like, oh, I don't like being touched. And your touch that I normally would like doesn't feel good when, for instance, I mentioned before, the house being a complete disaster is one of mine. Toys all over, the dishes not done, or just needing some time by myself for a minute or a walk outside. And I think it can be hard to pinpoint those things, but if you can start to notice like, oh, these are some stressors in my life that are keeping me from wanting to take time to be with my partner. I think those can help you start to realize too, like, oh, on top of the physical touch we can do for responsive desire, sometimes there's actual physical housework or like email work or whatever to do.
Mental load, it gets in the way of desire a lot. And also in a marriage, if you're feeling like you're carrying the majority of the mental load and the load of housework and childcare and stuff, that can not only cause extra stress for you, which makes it more difficult for you to feel sexual desire, but it also can create some resentment between you and your spouse, like, why am I doing all this work, and that can make sexual desire hard as well. So women will often talk about feeling really aroused or excited about sex when they see their husband do housework. It is not like vacuuming is not an explicitly sexual thing. What's happening is he's taking some of the mental load and allowing you to experience the desire that's already there. It's just buried under laundry and children.
Yes. And they're supporting you. And when you feel supported, you feel more satisfied in your relationship, which then can lend to more sexual fulfillment. Actually, this might not be interesting to some of you, but I was just reading a study about this where couples who share the housework more egalitarian and also the children and taking care of them, they have more sex and they're more fulfilled. And I just think that's really interesting and a hard thing because some of us maybe stay at home moms. So by nature during the day, we are having the majority of the housework and the children. Well, the housework doesn't really get done because of the children, but and but just figuring now, I know for me, this example might not be super helpful, but for me, I finally talked with my husband. I was like, I could really use your help with the laundry. And that has been a huge mental, emotional lift of just like, oh, he's going to wash it and fold it and help put it away. And so I think as a partnership, when you can figure those things out, how to split it and how to support each other with your loads, that will help desire come back. Cause it won't be buried as much.
Definitely. And having a partnership marriage or an egalitarian marriage, it doesn't just happen naturally for anyone, as far as I know. I mean, it's something that you really have to work towards and talk about often. My husband and I have to have conversations about what partnership looks like in our marriage right now. And we don't have any children and we're both working full time and it's still hard for us. So it's challenging to create that kind of marriage, but it really can be so good. Not just for your marriage in general, but for your sex life, it absolutely can.
And it's tricky. It's tricky.
It is, but it's so.
And it's never 50-50, which is okay, but just to feel supported and to figure out what that looks like, whether the husband does a little more, or the wife does a little more, just to figure out with you. And it doesn't matter what your family of origin or your friends are doing. I think that's something I've gotten stuck in is like to kind of combat these traditions that this isn't working for us. So we need to figure something else out. It can be hard.
Definitely. I love that. One other thing that I want to touch on a little bit more that you mentioned is this idea of taking note of times when you do feel desire. I would encourage you to even actually write them down. Take literal notes about when you feel desire and when you feel physical arousal, so that you can start to identify patterns. And you can also think about when you're really not feeling aroused. Like, when does it make you almost angry when your partner tries to initiate sex and you're like, no, not today. What has led to that experience for you? Understanding, the things that lead to sex and the things that lead to absolutely no sex can help you as you navigate your desire as well.
I like that idea. And that can be, I think that's really good though, to notice both. Notice when you're feeling desire and also those things, because there are things that make it by the end of the day, like, don't touch me. And that's a good clue to look in, like, what am I feeling? What do I need for me to help me get above that, to be able to show affection, even if it's just a hug? Because sometimes at the end you're like, I don't want anything.
Yeah.
To figure that out. And those times when you do.
Definitely. And I think for a lot of women, especially, exhaustion is a really prevalent one. So when you're feeling really tired, it is so hard to experience desire, because desire happens in your head. And when you're so exhausted, you do not want to be thinking about anything. You just want to go to bed. So you might need to say, like, I am not in a place to have sex after 9 p.m. Like, if we're going to have sex, we need to find a way to do it earlier in the day. And like, if that means that you're turning on cartoons for your kids and you're going upstairs and they're eating cold cereal for dinner, great, do your thing. But you just have to identify these things so that you can tell your spouse and yourself, like, it's really hard for me to feel desire at this time. Can we try and do something else so that I can enjoy sex?
And if you are feeling desire, to let them know. Because I know that's been something for me sometimes too. It's like, I was trying to show you, but I didn't use my words.
Yeah.
As we tell our kids all the time, use our words, like just use our words to say what we're thinking.
Yeah. Say the words, I want to have sex. It's not so scary.
But it can be. But yes, you can.
It doesn't need to be, is what I'm saying. Like, it might feel weird at first, but this is your person. Like, this is the person that you feel the closest to. They love you. You love them. You should be able to say, I want sex, just like you should be able to say, I am really hungry. I need food, or, I need to use the bathroom. You can say, I want to have sex. How do you feel about that? Or, I want to have sex. Do you want to have sex?
If this isn't a good time, when would you be ready? Right. And I love keeping that conversation open, because I know in my own life, I've had times where I kind of have told my husband, like, I only like having sex at night. And then it suddenly switched. And we were both like, what? You want to have sex in the morning? But we figured it out. And we would sometimes, I liked the idea, we would sometimes put cartoons on for our kids or find things to do, because it's important to connect, and it's okay to make those little shifts and changes that can be really challenging when you have kids in the house to figure it out.
Sex should be prioritized. Like, if you need to pick a friend and one night a week you give your kids to them and one night a week they give your kids to you, just so that you can have sex, do it. But sex, it needs to be prioritized for it to be good.
How can we open up this conversation with our partners though? Because this can be hard, especially as most men do have spontaneous desire. I think it can be really hard to kind of open up that conversation to help them understand where we're coming from and to help them be open to exploring with us. What are some of your tips that you would give to kind of talk about it and also help them understand what we need?
Well, one of my favorite ways to bring up conversations is using something that I learned somewhere else as a conversation starter. So I'll be like, so I learned something in this book today and I want to talk to you about it. Or, hey, guess what? I was listening to this podcast and they said this and I want to talk about it. So that's one of my favorite ways to start a conversation if I'm feeling nervous about it. But one thing that I would say is, if you lead out in any of these conversations with having a good sexual relationship with you is really important to me, so I want to talk to you about it. If you lead out with that, it opens the conversation in a different way than if you say, I never want to have sex spontaneously. That feels a little scary. But if you're like, listen, I love you and I want so badly to have a really meaningful, pleasurable sex life that is wonderful for both of us. So I want to have some conversations with you about how we can achieve that. And starting with that makes it feel like this is something that we're both working towards together. It makes it feel a little less scary in my mind. And then your partner knows that you're invested in this, and you're not going to tell them that you never want to have sex again, or you're not going to tell them that you're really, really unhappy with them as a person. Well, you might need to tell them that if you are, but for the most part, you might say, I'm really unhappy with our sex life. But if you're starting with, I want to have a really good one, it can feel less scary for both of you.
And it is a journey, and it can be a hard journey. I wish it wasn't, but it can. I know that from my own experience, and just especially being on the other side, hearing my husband's view, sometimes it's like, I was trying so hard, but we just could never figure things out. And it can be really draining. But I think, yeah, just having that open conversation that you want it and not settling for less. I think in most relationships with partners who love each other, you're going to want to work for something, even if it takes a while and is hard. And I love that idea of just kind of bringing it up. Like, I want this to be good. So I need your help to work together and figure it out. Sometimes as women, I think it can sometimes feel hard to feel desirable and to feel desire. I think a lot of us in our culture is kind of like, if you feel desire, that's not good. You should always feel desirable. But a lot of times feeling desirable, we've been shown it's about our looks, but in reality, in committed, loving relationships, it's not just about our looks. How can we kind of shift our view of desire and feeling desirable, that it's okay to feel desire, and it's okay to feel desirable even if we're not like done up and looking our best?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that we need to understand is that our partner's desire and arousal is not dependent on us. And that's important for us to understand for a lot of reasons. This is just one of them, but we can impact our partner's arousal and desire, of course. I'm not saying that we have no role to play in that, but we do not determine it. Our physical appearance is a very small part of sexual desire and arousal for our spouse. And accepting that is really, really important. Here's what I would recommend. Instead of focusing on trying to feel attractive to your spouse, try to focus on what you are both experiencing. It's not that you will feel desirable when you're attractive enough. You will feel desired when you're focusing on what your partner is doing.
I think sometimes as women, it can feel really hard to feel desirable because in the media, in the things that we've seen, it's all about attraction. And that's one of the huge myths that has been perpetuated about men, is that their desire comes mainly from physical appearances. And I was actually reading it. It's from Dr. Sarah Murray's book, Not Always in the Mood. She talks about this and how a lot of times our partners are actually giving us bids for connection and wanting to show love, and we miss them because as a culture, we have been kind of socialized to view men's desire based on how we look. How can we as women kind of shift that to understand that it's really about the connection and love, and our spouse may see us putting the baby to bed or talking with a friend and lighting up as we talk about something we're passionate about. And that's actually what's making them feel desire. Like, wow, I really love that she can do that. I love this. How can we kind of shift that view? And also, as women, part of that, we've kind of been socialized to not feel desire, that it's a bad thing for good girls. How can we kind of shift those views?
Yeah. I think this idea that men are basing all of their desire and arousal on attraction is so problematic for a lot of reasons. But I think the first step is really just getting to the point where you actually believe that what your partner wants from you and with you has so much more to do with your experience together, who you are as a person, than it does about the way that you look. I can admit that, like, Dallin, if he only cared about physical appearance, then this is not a nice thing to say about my husband, but if he only cared about physical appearance, then he probably wouldn't have chosen me. And that might not feel comforting, but to me, it feels like my husband chose me because of my soul, because of who I am, and he's attracted to me too. And that won't change even while my body will change. But it's such a small part of the connection that we have. So we have to get to the point where we believe that there is so much more to our partner's connection to us than their physical attraction to us, even sexually, maybe especially sexually. One of the things that has helped me with this is asking my spouse why they want to have sex with me. Asking them what makes them feel desire, what makes them feel aroused. And it's not that like, oh, you just looked so sexy in your PJs sitting at your computer working all day, you know? It's not that. It's just like, I just want to feel close to you. I love you so much. They want emotional connection just like women do. We just pretend like they don't. So that's one thing that you can do is ask your partner the reasons that they want to have sex, what sex feels like for them emotionally. It can be really sweet to hear what sex feels like emotionally to your spouse. The second thing I would say, as an effort to let go of your need to always feel physically attractive in a sexual setting, is to focus on the experience that you're having rather than thoughts that your spouse might be having about your body. Right? So we're always watching ourselves from someone else's perspective. This idea is called self-objectification, that we're always like body checking ourselves and kind of watching ourselves from someone else's view to see if we're attractive enough, put together enough. And we do that as women in sexual encounters. So we're thinking about, what is my spouse seeing from this angle, instead of what am I feeling with that person.
And we miss the connection they're trying to portray to us, the love and what they hope us to feel. Because we're like, oh, what are they seeing?
So in our heads about someone else's view, like actual physical view of us. So one way to combat that, instead of just trying to push those thoughts out, because that's really hard, just focus your thoughts on what you're experiencing. Look at your spouse and focus on them, on their experience, on your experience, not on what they might be thinking about your body, which they're probably not even thinking what you think they're thinking anyway. But that can be really helpful, is to just focus on what you're experiencing together.
I think those are really great tips, especially because it is so much more. And I love that idea, because we limit our spouse's desire so much when we just think it's about bodies. And I've had a rude awakening to this, especially after having kids, because our bodies always change. And I've always loved the idea of the cute old couples, but I'm like, wait a minute, that goes against what society taught us. Like, that means that they love each other. It's not about bodies, because our bodies are always changing. And especially with birth and children and age and wrinkles and all these things, it's actually can be really bonding to realize and shift that view and realize it so much more, and kind of giggle about the things that have changed from your youth.
Yeah. And the new sounds that your body is making. And our partner's desire is just not dependent on our physical appearance. It just isn't. And we don't need to worry about it being dependent on our physical appearance.
And what about to feel desire as women? This can be so hard. As we kind of close up with a couple actionable tips for women who are like, okay, this has all been really good, but I have a really hard time allowing myself to feel desire, even when my spouse is desiring me, or to even desire my spouse. How can I kind of work through that and recognize that it's good and that it's important for me to feel desire? What are some tips as women start on that journey?
So the first step is recognizing that desire is good, and that any desire you feel for your partner, for your spouse, is a good thing. And it should be not only leaned into, but it should be celebrated. If you're feeling a desire for any sexual experience with your spouse, you should be stoked about that, because sometimes it's hard to come by. But because a lot of us were taught growing up that women don't experience sexual desire, or when they do, that's wrong somehow. For those of us that grew up in really religious homes, sexual desire was viewed as sinful. And so it can be hard to retrain our minds to be excited about sexual desire. Really educating yourself about desire, the purposes of sex, how good it can be, can help you let go of some of those guilt traps. For individuals who grew up in very religious settings and have a lot of sexual guilt, I often recommend the book, The Great Sex Rescue. So that book has allowed me to let go of a lot of the negative beliefs that I had lingering from my growing up years about sex. So first, we have to get to the point where we believe that desire is good. And then once we do that, we have to start leaning into the desire that we experience. So I kind of think about it as my little desire breadcrumbs throughout the day. When there have been times where I've really, really struggled to experience sexual desire, but I want to experience sexual desire. So when anything comes into my head that's sexual about my spouse, I'll really lean into it. And by lean into it, I mean, see if I can make it go further. I'll keep thinking about my spouse or whatever brought up those feelings. I'll send him a text or something. We have one emoji that we send when we want to have sex.
That's a cute idea.
I'll send him the emoji, and so that he knows hey, I'm feeling a little bit like this. And that way it allows me to think more about what might happen later on if we have sex. And I give myself the space to think about sex and to enjoy thinking about sex. It's not a bad thing to think about sex with your spouse. That's such a good thing. So I'll just let myself enjoy thinking about it throughout the day. And then I'll start to experience sexual desire, even though I really wasn't feeling sexual desire at first. I just maybe had the thought, hey, I wouldn't be opposed to sex today, which isn't an incredibly sexy experience, that's a pretty low bar, but I can work with that. So when you feel a little twinge of something, any desire, any arousal, do your best to work with that and see if you can build on it.
I love that idea. And I wanted to just add one question. I know we were closing up, but I feel like this is an important question. I think for some of us, we've kind of been taught that desire is a negative thing, especially when we have thought about how we've been taught that it's about attraction and men's desire being kind of uncontrolled around attraction. And so as women, sometimes I think there's fear too that desire is not controllable and that there will be arousal because of other people or things that aren't our spouse, which I believe that actually does happen because we can't control what arouses us, and that's okay. But what are some tips you would give to help when those things happen that it's oh, I felt a little bit of desire arousal, but that's not in my context of marriage? What are some tips to allow desire to be opened up, but to make sure to keep it within your value base? Because I think that's part of the fear sometimes is am I going to lose the control of it if I feel it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is hard to learn how to let some desire in and still keep ourselves from desire for things that we don't want. One of the ways that we can do that is to not try to necessarily stomp out the desire that we're experiencing, but just shift it into our context. So if, for example, you're watching a movie and there's a kissing scene or a sexual scene and you're starting to feel aroused, but you're thinking about the man that you're seeing in the movie, for example, or the woman that you're seeing in the movie, you don't have to be no, 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 body, we're not doing this. We do not feel desire in this context. Instead, you can just shift it and put your spouse or your partner right into your mind and say, I am having some sexual desire, but the person that I've chosen to express that with is my spouse. So I'm going to pull them into this experience. And if I'm going to allow myself to continue feeling sexual desire, which is okay, then it's going to be directed at my spouse. That feels more doable than like, nope, no desire for me. And trying to stomp out desire makes it harder to open ourselves up to desire in other contexts. So I would just use any sexual context and turn it into your relationship, turn it towards your spouse.
And I know for me, sometimes I felt a little fear, like, what if my husband sees a lady at work that he's attracted to her? What if I see someone? But I actually think that's a lot of the beauty and trust that comes in a relationship, that when those outside arousals, I don't know what you want to call them, that kind of like insight, arousal, or desire, that you choose each other, even if other things have started it. And to keep that conversation open, like my husband and I, this might sound kind of awkward, but we have had conversations that like, oh, I saw someone today and I was attracted, but I like turned my thoughts to you. And I think that's such a great way to not shut off your desire, because your desire, you can't really control what happens with arousal, but you can control where you channel it. And I'm glad, I just wanted to bring that up because I think that is a tricky thing to navigate.
Definitely. I think you brought up such an important point that I really want people to understand. We have this idea of romance, kind of this I only have eyes for you idea, which is such a beautiful thought. But the truth is we all have eyes. Like we're not looking for other people, but we are looking at other
people. We're humans.
So,
we can see like beautiful things.
Right. Totally. Attraction will happen to everyone. Emotional attraction can happen, physical attraction can happen, sexual arousal can happen, and that's totally normal and does not for a second mean that your spouse isn't completely committed to you or that you're not completely committed to your spouse. Commitment comes in the turning from that person to your person. The attraction is normal as long as we're reining it in. We're turning it towards the person that we've chosen.
And I'm so glad that we covered that though, because I think that's a scary thing when we allow desire. It's like, wait, I just felt this and it's not for my spouse, but you have the ability to turn it. And that's the most important thing. Thank you so much, Carlie. This has been awesome again.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can find Carlie at Carlie Palmer-Webb on Instagram. Okay, can everyone just take a deep breath and recognize that even if you haven't felt desire in a while, it's there. It just needs to be found in a different way than what we've been shown by spontaneous desire and what that looks like. I hope that this episode was a good, thought-provoking episode that can help you start to kind of uncover that desire. And I know for me, as I've been on this journey, a huge thing that has helped me is something that Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife talks about. And she talks about how sometimes we have these meaning frames around sex that it's another thing on our to-do list to serve someone else, especially in the meaning frame of that sex is more for our partner or spouse. And to be able to shift that meaning frame to see that sex is for you. Sex is for me. It's a time that we can be taken care of, that our spouse or partner can serve us and love on us. And it's something that can refresh us instead of being one more thing to serve someone else and do something else for someone else when we may feel totally touched out and totally done giving to people throughout the day, especially with little kids or families. It can be tricky, but it's something for you to refresh and to feel loved and taken care of. To briefly recap some of Carlie's tips on recognizing our desire and starting to uncover it, she talked about that, first of all, we need to recognize that desire is good, that any desire that you're feeling for your spouse, or if something else starts that desire, to shift it for your spouse, that should be leaned into, and it's good. And I really liked her idea of having a secret code word or emoji that you can send each other to kind of say, hey, I'm thinking that I might want to have sex today. Another thing she talked about is to educate yourself about desire and how good it can be, how good sex can be. And she suggested reading the book, The Great Sex Rescue, especially for those of us who may have grown up in purity culture. And the last thing that I want to point out is that willingness or not being opposed to sex is a great place to start. Even though that bar may seem really low, it's a great place to start building on and leaning into the breadcrumbs. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm excited to chat again next week. Thanks for talking love. Join the conversation at ladies.talkinglove on Instagram and tag your friends who would like to participate. You can also check out our website, ladiestalkinglove.com, where you can access each episode and join our exclusive newsletter. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Instagram or by email to hello@ladiestalkinglove.com as we learn together. Thanks for talking love.